This slide tells you how to maximize your learning throughout the series of slides. So go ahead and look at the preview points to ponder and connect them to your experiences and what you have previously learned as you go through this lesson. Lesson objectives for this series of slides include to determine the language arts skills, processes, and knowledge adolescents need to master for the workplace. Identify ways to make intensive interventions available to adolescents who are below in grade level in reading and writing. And discriminate among effective reading programs for adolescents. Finally, analyze the skills needed to use technology effectively. This is something that Donald Liu, one of the experts labeled below or noted below, calls the new literacies. Robert Slavin is another expert in the field of adolescent literacy. Some points to ponder before you go through the rest of the slides in this lesson, in the series of lessons. What are some ways that you believe would work to improve adolescent literacy learning? What have you tried? What have you seen? What makes sense to you? What evidence have you needed to convince you to try different strategies with struggling adolescent readers? And finally, what special needs do you think adolescent students have, and how can you accommodate these needs? So if you can keep these points in mind as you go through the rest of the slides, I think you'll come up with some answers. There's a wonderful IES practice guide on improving adolescent literacy, and you have the website for accessing this guide. As all other guides, their strategies, their recommendations are based on research, and they will label it according to whether it has a strong base, a moderate base, or a low base. Although the title of the guide is on improving adolescent literacy, they have included studies on 4th and 5th grade students because the researchers have felt that their literacy and instructional needs have more in common with adolescents than the students in the early grades. Like other practice guides, this is written by a group of experts, and they have determined that reading ability is a key predictor of achievement in the content areas. As you're working on your thematic units and you're integrating language arts with content areas, it is important to consider some of the reading skills that you might want to emphasize in your unit. Reading instruction decreases in the upper grades. Whether this is a good or bad thing, you will discover as we go through this particular guide, but the fact is they have noted that as students go through the upper grades, they get less and less instruction on how to read. Teachers must know, though, how to help students acquire reading skills, and yet many teachers at these higher grade levels feel unprepared. There are some serious concerns about adolescents and their level of literacy proficiency. 69% of 8th grade students score below the proficiency level for text comprehension. The proficiency level is grade level. We're not talking about advanced. This is just being proficient at the grade level. 26% of 8th grade students read below basic, where they don't even have partial mastery of the basic skills needed for reading. High school students have been found to be underprepared for workplace literacy demands. Reading ability is key to content area achievement. And with all of these facts that I've just read to you, we must pay serious attention to the older students. However, teachers report that they really don't know how to help these students. Many of them report that they are unprepared to teach reading skills. A social studies teacher, a math teacher, and a science teacher, fine arts teachers, all want to teach their content, and they are not sure how to proceed when they have to help them learn to read the material. And they have a certain resistance to that, partially because they're unprepared, partially because they're limited by time and want to teach their content, and partially maybe because they don't realize that this is something that has to be done if they expect their students to learn. By now, you're probably familiar with the IES practice guides and how they provide recommendations to help you in your teaching of reading and literacy. Recommendation 1 for improving adolescent literacy is to provide explicit vocabulary instruction. This has strong evidence, meaning that when you do provide that explicit vocabulary instruction, you can be sure that you are giving your students the best possible instruction. They have noted that learning words incidentally, such as listening to them, hearing them with no instruction, that they will learn the words 15% of the time. So incidental word learning occurs, but not at a very high rate. Explicit instruction is needed for those important academic words. Academic words are words that students need to know in order to make sense of the academic content that they're learning, such as science, such as math. These are not words that are used generally in conversations, but they are found throughout textbook and reading materials during the academic content area lessons. Words are learned best through repeated exposure up to 17 times. Now that doesn't mean that they write the word 17 times or they chant the word 17 times with its meaning, but instead you're going to give them opportunities to encounter that word in different contexts 17 times. In other words, it takes time and exposure to learn some words. And the next bullet pretty much says that words are learned through exposure in various contexts. Students must know the meaning of words to comprehend content. And I want you right now to consider the information or the wording in italics and think about what this might mean. Consider the relationship between word meaning and content in word meaning. Is this relationship reciprocal? And if it is, how? And how might you apply that insight into your own classroom practice? All right, continuing with recommendation 1, these are some other things that are recommended for you to do for teaching vocabulary explicitly. Select words that are useful, and then in parentheses, frequent or necessary. Use direct instruction to teach word meaning. Teach the students how to use the dictionary and glossaries. Use direct instruction to help them read the words and definitions and match those words to their definitions. Use direct instruction to help students with oral recitation, memorization, use of graphic displays, and graphic organizers. You need to model how these are used, explain how they're used and their purpose, and then involve them in a variety of different ways for learning word meaning. The goal of direct instruction is to promote independence. You start out by teaching them, you continue with support, and you gradually relinquish that support so that they can know these facts and skills and processes well enough to use them on their own. For example, you want them to learn how to analyze semantic and syntactic clues for meaning. Semantic means word meaning. Syntactic has to do with word order in a sentence or grammar. And you also want them to automatically start using prior knowledge without being told. Recommendation 2, provide direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction. This too has strong evidence that it works. And we're back to comprehension. Because comprehension is reading, is the primary goal of reading, Each researcher that talks about strategies for improving literacy has a strong comprehension component in there. So this should begin to sound pretty familiar to you. Comprehension strategies are routines and procedures that readers use to help them make sense of text. And in one of the definitions, they used intentional. If you inserted that word into this, it would be routines and procedures that readers intentionally use to help them make sense of text. Summarizing, here are some different strategies. Summarizing, asking and answering questions, paraphrasing, and finding the main ideas. The best strategies, research has shown, are best taught explicitly. When teaching strategies, select appropriate text for the strategy and the student. Show students how to apply these strategies. That's called modeling, demonstration. Thinking aloud helps. Provide guided practice. That's where you're supporting the students as they work. And of course, make sure the students know the goal of the strategy, the purpose for using it. Recommendation 3 for improving adolescent literacy. Provide opportunities for extended discussion of text meaning and interpretation. Evidence is moderate. To engage students in high-quality discussions of meaning, plan for the discussion. Focus on content area resources. Develop questions that lead students to think reflectively. Develop questions that are appropriate for the content. Require students to expand and elaborate on their answers. And develop and practice the use of a specific discussion protocol. Perhaps if Dr. Pearson and others who seem to think that we should limit discussion and spend more time on either reading or reading instruction might endorse discussion when it is structured in the way that the IES folks have found. These are research-based ways for conducting discussions, and if they are structured well, they would have a good place in your curriculum for teaching reading comprehension. But it is interesting to note that there's a little bit of tension, a little bit of conflict between discussion, not to have discussion, how much discussion, etc. But I think the better your discussion is planned, the more likely it will be productive for your students. Recommendation 4. Increase student motivation and engagement in literacy learning, and the evidence for that is moderate. If you recall, we also had increasing student motivation for improving early literacy, and so motivation is one of those factors that runs throughout the different grade levels. Motivation to read school-related texts declines as students progress from elementary to middle school, and that's just a fact. And why would this be? What might cause this? Research shows that extrinsic awards are not effective for long-term motivation of reading, that at some point students have to start wanting to read for either the enjoyment of it or for what reading can do for them as far as providing information. Establish meaningful context learning goals and provide specific feedback in order to increase their motivation. Continuing with recommendation 4 that deals with motivation, give specific feedback on student success on meeting their goals. It's very important for students to know what goals they're working toward. It would be excellent if you and the students could work together to set some goals, perhaps 1 or 2 goals to start with, goals where it challenges the students and yet that they are doable for the student with some work and with some guidance on your part. When, as they're working toward their goals, tell them how well they're doing. Tell them what they're doing well, what they still have to work on, and give them specific feedback. Allow for student choice regarding the types of reading and writing and selection of materials. And again, student choice was an important motivational factor for younger students as well. Make literacy experiences more relevant to their lives and current events. Why do they have to learn these things? Why do they have to read? Why do they have to learn content area learning? What is the relevance to the students? Continuing with motivation and how to use it to improve adolescent literacy, the IES guide suggests that you build in self-regulation such as goal setting, self-directed learning, and collaborative learning. Now, goal setting is related to self-directed learning. Collaborative learning would simply be where your students are collaborating with you or each other in order to share ideas, in order to see where they are in meeting their goals. Goals to increase reading engagement and learning include making connections between or among content areas. This is something that you are doing in your assignment for the thematic unit. Also, students should be making connections among the various strategies for learning. Recommendation 5 for improving adolescent literacy is to make available intensive interventions for struggling readers that can be provided by trained specialists. We're talking about Tier 3 interventions here. Interventions for students who exhibit below grade level literacy skills must be intensive and individualized. They must be done by reading specialists who have specific training to teach adolescents. They must accelerate literacy development. There is a two-step process for implementing interventions. One has to do with initial screening, and the other has to do with diagnostic tests of fundamental reading skills. So in other words, you do an initial screening, and then you go in with deeper assessments, diagnostic tests, to find out what fundamental reading skills need to be remediated. This is an essential slide to consider for your students who have had a history of failure and who are very likely to continue to fail and end up as a dropout statistic. They are frustrated, they are demoralized, they are shamed. Something very intensive has to happen to move them out of those states. Continuing with recommendation number 5 for improving adolescent literacy, work with your students to set goals for improvement. Provide students with learning aids such as advanced organizers, graphic displays, something tangible, something more concrete for them to use as they're learning. Match the needs of the student to the intensiveness of the intervention. Teach small groups or teach students individually, and provide repeated experiences and regulate scaffolding, meaning the amount of support you're giving them as the student progresses. All right, here's a point to ponder that should seem very familiar to you. In the IES guides that you have, the practice guides, is a section called Roadblocks and Suggested Approaches. Because adolescent literacy is such an important topic, because you are really striving, it's your last chance to help these students before they end up dropping out of school. You really need to look at some of the roadblocks that are in your way as far as helping them, and some of the research-based approaches that have been shown to work. Also think about your own experiences, especially if you're teaching students in grades 4 and above, and how their lack of literacy has impacted their learning and their attitude. There's a podcast that you will want to listen to by Dr. Robert Slavin. He's known for cooperative learning, and he's known for Success for All, and he's also known for developing middle and high school reading programs, and actually doing research related to these programs to see what works for teachers. The podcast website is on the top of this slide that you can just click on in order to hear what he has to say. Now, Dr. Slavin has reviewed research on effective reading programs, and here are some of the things he has found. Textbooks and programs all get the same results related to student achievement. In other words, it doesn't really matter which textbook series you adopt or which program you adopt, they all get the same results. So what is the difference? It's the teacher. The teacher makes a difference in instructional decisions related to content strategies, cooperative learning, use of technology, and classroom management. And so you are the one that's going to make the difference in your students' lives. Good programs, though, do have some things in common. They have clear goals and teacher development so that teachers can be helped along the way and to know how to help students achieve their goals. And so good programs do help teachers. The teachers make the difference. There's a nice connection there. Once you have listened to the podcast by Dr. Slavin, consider these following points. What do teachers have to know to create a good reading program for upper elementary and middle school students? And in your experience, what are some stumbling blocks that teachers face when planning and teaching an effective reading program? You can also recall some of the roadblocks and approaches that were in the IES guide as well. The next few slides are for Lesson 8, talking about new literacies. You will be watching a video by Donald Liu on new literacies. He is the guru of this field. He's the one who has coined the term new literacies. New literacies are the knowledge and skills for selecting and learning information from the internet. New literacies promotes a transition from narrative text to text that informs. So from narrative text to informational text. New literacies require knowledge of vocabulary, sentence and text level structures, and they require a purpose for reading. New literacies also require the students to have background knowledge of the content so that they can enter keyword descriptors. All right, new literacies. Students are required to identify important questions so that they can focus on internet research. They have to know what it is that they want to find so they know that whether the research that they have found is relevant to their search. When they're searching for information, students must analyze information, evaluate the information to determine whether it helps them answer their questions or their problem. They also have to determine whether the website has the information they are looking for. Notice as we go through some of the requirements for learning new literacies that the students are required to think at a very high level in DAOK 3 and often 4 levels. So new literacies are something that must be taught to the students and they must be practiced. For new literacies, they are required to analyze and evaluate information. They must check the credibility of the writer of the source. Many times there's a lot of information out there and not all of it is credible. How can they determine which to believe and which they should just disregard? They have to validate the accuracy of the information. They have to determine which of all this world of information that we now have, which information is relevant for their use. Once they have done that, they have to synthesize all of this information. They have to figure out how they're going to organize it. They have to engage in comprehension monitoring, which is metacognition, to ensure that the information fits with the question or the problem. Some other aspects of new literacies that you will be hearing in the podcast has to do with communication. Students must understand that information is exchanged between the reader and the writer, and that the reader and the writer has a real purpose for communicating and receiving information. New literacies enable students to use reading and writing in very authentic ways, and that is something that has not happened for students who came before in an era devoid of cell phone use and internet use and Facebook and all the other ways that the readers and writers are now receiving and communicating information. In the new literacies, they have to learn search strategies. And as a teacher, he suggests that you limit students to search on the first 5 results. Have ask questions of the students and have them find answers. And so these are some strategies that you can use to help them conduct good searches. Teaching the new literacies can be combined with content area learning, and he refers to this as 2-fers and 3-fers and 4-fers, etc. Dr. Liu gives you several suggestions for getting started in teaching students to use the new literacies. One, he suggests that you limit the number of strategies that you introduce at one time. Clearly state what you want students to master for each strategy. This next one is an interesting one. Have students do research first offline to develop background knowledge. Remember, they are thinking at DOK levels 3 and 4, and so developing that background knowledge will enable them to think at these higher levels when they're actually online. Provide a purpose for the lesson, and then consult the web to see what other teachers are doing. There are numerous excellent websites out there that show teacher practices, teacher lesson plans for teaching literacies to the students, the new literacies to their students. And also consult authors' pages. For example, Patricia Polacco and others now all combine some of the new literacy aspects into their suggestions for using their books. Dr. Liu also talks about differentiating new literacy instruction for low and high level learners. For your weaker students, the teacher takes them through a website by modeling it, by demonstrating and providing guided practice. So that's more of a direct instruction lesson. For your strong students, let them use the strategies for independent internet exploration. They don't need to be held by the hand. They don't need the guided practice once they have learned the strategies. Though you will want to check on them to see if there are any areas that they do need to have help. There are some safety issues that you must be aware of and things that you should or can do as a classroom teacher to promote safety. The first one is to have parents sign an acceptable use policy. This may be required by your school or by your district, so you need to check on that. There are filters that are required by law for schools who accept government funding. In order to limit the links that the students follow, the teachers can create a classroom web page, and that way they can put the links that are relevant to the studies and control the students that way as they navigate through the internet. You can establish a 4-click rule to minimize distractions and inappropriate usage. And finally, you can place some monitors facing the center of the classroom to enable you, the teacher, and the other students to monitor what's going on with the computers. Here are some final points to ponder after learning about adolescent literacy and the importance of the interventions to help save those children who are just continuing to fail in school. And also for the new literacies and the various literacies and technologies that you can also integrate into your teaching. 1. Determine the language arts skills, knowledge, and processes students use as they engage in the new literacy and content area learning. And how can you use these various technologies to motivate engagement and learning in your classroom?